So hi there, I'm Molly. I'm one of the physios over at Glenfield. I've got Neha here as well. She's one of our occupational therapists at Glenfield. And we're here today to come talk a bit about early rehabilitation on critical care. So at the minute it is Rehab November, which is a national initiative across intensive care across the country, where we're aiming to raise a bit more awareness about the importance of early rehab and how the whole MDT can get involved. And that's why we're presenting on today.
Yeah, lovely.
So we're going to go through what is early rehabilitation, the different benefits, physical and cognitive, and have a look at some of the national rehab guidelines for intensive care, and then talk a bit about what we've been doing in Rehab November at the minute. So what is early rehabilitation? I think when we think of rehab, we tend to think of the physical side of rehab. So we think about getting people out of bed and stood and walking, but rehab is so much more holistic than that. It incorporates the whole individual, the cognitive side, the psychological side, and the impact of staying in intensive care. The literature is quite divided as to what constitutes early rehabilitation and what time frame we're talking about. Some say it's like any therapeutic intervention in the first 2 or 3 days of a critical care stay, and others say it's just when they are physiologically stable enough to be rehabbing. So more people are surviving their intensive care stay due to advances in intensive care medicine, which is fantastic. However, this has led to a significant increase in worsening of physical, cognitive, and mental problems that happens as a result from a critical care stay, and this is known as PICS, so post-intensive care syndrome. And it's kind of long thought now that survival alone from intensive care isn't enough, and we need to support those individuals to be returning to how they were before their intensive care stay. So PICS also acts as a barrier to being discharged home and participation in their normal daily life. So we all know that staying in bed is really bad for us. But just to kind of highlight this a bit more from a physical side, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the physical benefits of rehabilitation or early rehab. So this study in young healthy individuals, they were immobilised, they had 2 weeks of bed rest, and this was associated with a 5 to 9% loss in quadricep muscle mass and a 20 to 27% reduction in subsequent muscle strength. And it's thought that these effects of immobilisation and bed rest are accelerated in older individuals, those who receive mechanical ventilation, and those in multi-organ failure compared to single organ failure. So that makes up quite a large proportion of our critical care patients. So from a musculoskeletal point of view, early rehab is associated with an improvement in peripheral muscle strength as measured by hand grip strength. And hand grip strength is also correlated with mechanical ventilation duration and can be used to predict successful extubations. It's associated with an improvement in isometric quadricep strength, so things like standing and walking, that's really important for, and a reduced incidence of ICU-acquired weakness. ICU-acquired weakness, of course, weakness as a result of intensive care stay when there is no other kind of reason for this, and often associated with multi-organ failure. From a respiratory point of view, early rehab is associated with a reduced risk of ventilator-acquired pneumonias and hospital-acquired pneumonias. It also aids faster weaning from ventilation and can help with decannulation. And kind of lastly, from a functional point of view, early rehab is associated with an improved functional status at hospital discharge, as measured by things like the Barthel Index, which looks at an individual's ability to wash and dress themselves, to toilet themselves, get up and down stairs. Early rehab is also associated with an improved walking ability at ICU discharge, as measured by a 6-metre walk test or timed up and go test. Associated with an improved quality of life and an overall reduced hospital length of stay. So the research we've kind of looked at briefly there, and the research out there about early rehab in intensive care definitely has limitations, and there's not much of it. For starters, there is quite an inconsistent definition of what constitutes early rehab. As I touched on before, there's discrepancy in the literature as to when do we start this early rehabilitation and what constitutes that. There's often quite insufficient detail of therapeutic interventions and what kind of constitutes standard care group as well. And lastly, the question of frequency, intensity, time, type, duration of early rehab remains unanswered, and we need larger and better controlled, randomized controlled trials, and I'll just answer this better. So safety is often seen as a significant barrier to early physical rehabilitation. For good reason, these patients are often very unstable, they might have lots of attachments. However, a systematic review and meta-analysis in 2017 looked at over 7,500 patients and 22,000 mobilisation sessions, and they found an instance of safety events occurring 2.6% of the time. And these sort of safety events were things like kind of transient hemodynamic changes or desaturation that self-resolved once rehab was stopped, the person's got back to bed, and most of the time did not need any further medical intervention. And they concluded from this that early rehab appeared safe for critical care patients.
So, like Molly said, rehab is not just the physical side, it's looking at the cognitive side as well as the psychological side. So on ITU, we do a lot of cognitive stimulation, and those are just different activities to serve and engage and challenge those cognitive processes, which are essential for daily functioning. So how do we sort of support on ITU? So we look at music, and there's a lot of research out there supporting music for patients. It instantly boosts mood, supports their interactions with staff, family members. The use of a phone and tablet, which is quite important because a lot of the times when they're on ITU, they're critically unwell, they're not in touch with their family or friends. So even getting like a video call once their sedation is sort of lowered, that makes such a big difference for patients. Looking at utilising the TVs that are available and different games. The games are quite key because it supports upper limb functioning. Like for them, it might be just a game, but actually for us, it's looking at that rehab, picking up, you know, different bits of counters, or if you're doing like a jigsaw puzzle, you're thinking about what they're thinking. It sort of gets them to do that a lot. So the benefits of cognitive stimulation, there's a reduction in delirium, improved quality of life, supports the sleep-wake cycle, which is so important on ITU. A lot of our patients are not sleeping at night, and actually giving them the cognitive stimulation during the day will help them be awake during the day and actually sleep at night. Being able to use the phone, that again helps them to contact their family members. Having a set routine, because when you come into hospital, your routine, your identity is all taken away from you and you feel like you're lost, you know, you're not in the right place. But actually what we do is support the routine. So we try and put as much as we can to support their normal routine at home. Whether that's, you know, having a shower in the morning, we would try and make sure that they're washed and dressed in the morning, for example. Delirium, so ICU acquired delirium is quite common, and there was research that 83% of patients who are on mechanical ventilation on ITU get delirium. You get the different types of delirium, so you have hyperactive, which was 23%, hypoactive 24.5% to 43.5%, and a mixed delirium, which is 52.5%. So on ITU we see a lot of the mixed delirium. Looking at sort of delirium management, there is the NICE guidelines to support with that, and they sort of suggest that the antipsychotic medication is associated with a number of adverse effects. So therefore it should only be considered as a short-term treatment, and if the patient is at risk of themselves or other people. The first thing to think about is trying to do de-escalation techniques with our patients before we give them that haloperidol and lorazepam. The problem with the haloperidol and lorazepam is when they get given it overnight, it impacts their rehab the next day because they're so sleepy, they're so drowsy, and then they're not doing anything with us, which again doesn't support the sleep-wake cycle. So what we do to sort of support delirium is orientation boards. We have that in front of the patient, constantly sort of telling them what day it is, where they are, why they're here. Daylight therapy, there's a lot of research out there to support taking patients outside, especially if they've been on ITU for such a long time, just for that fresh air and brightness outside makes such a difference on mood, cognition. Getting family members to bring familiar items and photos in. So sometimes you might find there's loads of photos of family members like in front of the nurse's trolley, which helps our patients, and it just gets like a conversation started as well. Like you can just chat to them like, oh, who is this in the photo, and things like that, which help. Family education, that's a big thing that we do, and it's making sure that families understand what delirium is, because a lot of the times they don't know and they're actually quite scared or traumatized by the way their family members are presenting. So it's actually educating them on that. Supporting the sleep-wake cycle again, managing the pain, and address any sort of sensory deprivation. So if they normally wear glasses or have hearing aids, making sure that, you know, they are wearing that whilst they're on the unit and when they can. The other things we sort of promote is, you know, we do different assessments and functional assessments which help us with cognition. So we do like washing and dressing, shaving assessment, shower assessment, writing assessments, which sort of helps us, especially when they've got a trachea in and they can't communicate. It's for us to check their grip strength and actually can they hold a pen so that they can write a message. And that's also important for the patient in their rehab journey. It's looking at, you know, their routine, their identity, and promoting that independence as much as possible. A lot of the times when you're in hospital, staff will just do the wash for the patient, but actually the patient might be able to wash their top half themselves. It just gives them that bit of independence for themselves.
Cool, so we're going to come on to some of the national guidelines for rehab in critical illness. These NICE guidelines originally came out in 2009 and they've been revamped in 2017. And the key messages from these is that is to promote early instructed rehab on critical care. They stress the importance of having key or nominated workers responsible for that individual's rehab. MDT working communication is incredibly important to the individual. They recommended having closer links between critical care, the ward and the community for that patient's step down. About how we as therapy teams aim to meet those NICE guidelines on the units at Glenfield and at the Royal. So the first one, all patients who are here on the unit for more than 4 days will screen into our rehab pathway, which will then do a more comprehensive assessment of them, use outcome measures like CPACs, so the Chelsea Physical Assessment Tool, the IMS, the ICU Mobility Scale. We'll also agree goals with them, so if possible with that patient, with their family. The second one is that having a structured, individualised rehab plan must be handed over to the ward on discharge. So those who screen into our rehab pathway, those who've been here for more than 4 days, and we run an outreach service, so we will go to the wards to continue their rehab there, and often see them with the ward physios in order to transition the care over to the ward physio and make sure they're getting that continuity with their therapy and achieving their goals. The third one, I think, is one that we should be trying to do a bit better from a therapy team. So patients should be given information about their rehab goals on discharge from hospital. And that probably requires us to work a bit closer with the wards teams to see if we're managing to achieve this. And then lastly, those with the length of stay over 4 days should have a review 2 to 3 months post-discharge. So I know all of our ITU patients get that clinic follow-up if they've been with us more than 4 days, usually with the medical team and with some of the nurses. At the minute, physios are not funded to be in those clinics, so we're unable to attend them, which I think is a big gap in our service provision, and able to support the individual with their physical and their overall rehab out in the community. And these are the ICS GPICS guidelines, which pretty much echo the same as the NICE guidelines. And one of their recommendations at the bottom I want to talk a bit more about from our point of view is that at the bottom, physiotherapy, both chest and rehab, should be offered on a 7-day service. So recently, the therapy team at Glenfield undertook a 7-day service trial, which ran from April to July this year. So normally our working hours are 8 till 4, 5 days a week. And then at weekends, it's just respiratory cover from a respiratory trained but not critical care trained physiotherapist. And no rehabilitation is usually provided at weekends because we don't have the staffing capacity for it. During this trial, the physio service provision was uplifted to 8 till 6, 7 days a week, with the goal of providing at least 2 rehab sessions for our long stay patients, so those here for more than 4 days during the week, and at least 1 rehab session for those long stay patients at weekends. As it says here, outside of this trial and currently at the minute, because it's ended, patients do not receive rehab at weekends. And over at the Royal, they acted as our control sites. They just carried on with their normal working pattern. So these are some of our real key results. And these results, I'm kind of just telling to you guys, the data and all that was analysed by Claire and Ellie, who are our clinical specialists and advanced physio practitioner. So all the credit needs to go to them. But during the 7-day trial, we found that those receiving rehab at weekends, those long stay patients, increased from 22% to 83% at weekends. We found that they were achieving milestones about 4 days sooner than our control over at the Royal. So things like the first sit on the edge of the bed and the first stand, nearly 4 days sooner during the 7-day trial. And the real key result, I think, was that throughout the trial, we found our long stay patients were being discharged from intensive care roughly 3 days sooner than they were pre-trial. And this is kind of to promote a bit about what we're doing during Rehab November at the minute. And this is the Glenfield timetable, but I know the Royal are doing very similar things. So we're having drop-in teaching sessions on a Monday afternoon, really informal kind of practical sessions. We've got sweets and badges and stuff, different themes. So if you're available and want to, please come and drop in and see us on those times. As you can see, the themes, we've done one already on physical rehab. This Monday, dietitians are in talking about feeding and rehabilitation. We've got a session on cognitive rehab and then a bit about our ICU transition service. We've also got a hand grip strength competition out. This is in Glenfield. If you guys want to go and enter, there'll be prizes at the end of the month. And we're also doing like a team cycle as a bike in Sea Bay. We're trying to see as a unit how far we can cycle throughout the whole month. Next one. Yeah. And here are a few things that we've been doing with patients just this week for Rehab November. So there's the bike. We've got our big Rehab November board, and we managed to get one of our long stay patients' dog to come and see him on Tuesday, which is really exciting. That meant a lot to him, and that's what we kind of mean by like real holistic rehab. This was so important to his mood, being able to see his dog after 28 days apart, and yeah, just meant the world to him.
Yeah. Any questions or anything? I think that's it really from us. But
thank you guys for coming.
That's really good. Often think about that side of ICU when we're looking at the acutely medical, like the illness side rather than the getting better side.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you for joining us on Teams over at the Royal. Yeah, we can see that here.
Perfect. So hi guys, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Alex. I'm one of the ACCS EM trainees over at the Royal, and I've been asked to do Journal Club today. So the paper that I was given was a little bit different. It was, as I say, related to physiotherapy. So it's looking at early in-bed cycle ergometry with critically ill, mechanically ventilated patients. However, this paper was more focused on the statistical analysis plan for the study rather than the study itself. However, since this paper has been published, the results have started to come out. So I've kind of done an eclectic mix of both. So before I go on to the next slide, like what are some of the side effects that you see of a prolonged ITU admission? Deconditioning, yeah, absolutely. Anything else?
Acquired weakness.
Yeah, I mean, you guys can probably tell where this talk is going, kind of based upon this. So yeah, they're the two answers I was kind of looking for. But obviously there are lots of side effects of being in ITU long term. But as you guessed, the one I wanted to focus on were ICU acquired weakness and deconditioning. And our patients are at a very, very high risk of doing that, particularly their lug muscles. So the paper that I was asked to look at actually states that the quadriceps are the most at risk, and you can lose 18% of that muscle mass within a 10-day ITU admission, which I thought was surprisingly high. And obviously our survivors of critical illness often have long-term effects even when they're discharged, and the follow-up for patients even after 1 year has found that some 50% of our patients are still not back in work. One of the ways of measuring their function is to look at their 6-minute walking distance, which kind of does as it says on the tin. And again, a lot of our patients have a below normal 6-minute walking distance. So previous studies have demonstrated that obviously physical rehab is really, really important, which we know anyway, thanks to our fabulous physios. But they can really improve the functional outcome for patients at discharge. So there was another study that looked at in-bed cycling, and for those of you who don't know what that involves, I'd really Google a picture, because it's, you know, quite interesting to see it, especially in mechanically ventilated patients. And they looked at starting that after 2 weeks after an ITU admission. They found that it did improve this objective 6-minute walking distance at discharge. So the study that I was asked to look at is called the CYCLE study, which stands for Critical Care Cycling to Improve Lower Extremity Strength, which was a randomized controlled trial. And their research question was looking at both medical and surgical ITU patients, and does 30 minutes of in-bed cycling and usual physiotherapy started within 4 days of mechanical ventilation compared to usual physiotherapy alone improve patient function at 3 days post-ITU. So this study was much more focused on a shorter duration of mechanical ventilation and follow up much quicker rather than data down the line at the 1 year. So the study had quite a very broad inclusion criteria. Basically, they just had to be somebody who was over the age of 18, admitted for any variety of things. They did exclude people who'd had kind of acute difficulty with their neuromuscular weakness or impaired cycling ability prior to their ITU admission, and then people that had sort of traumatic brain injury or had difficulty following the language of the local unit prior to admission as well. Pregnant ladies were also excluded, and those that had a very high risk of expected hospital mortality. So the intervention was that they would do 30 minutes per day of in-bed cycling in addition to usual physiotherapy. And those interventions would be 5 days per week, as our physios have highlighted, Monday to Friday during their ITU stay. The assessors at the 3-day post-ITU assessment were blinded to their treatment group, and then they filled out an objective form, which we'll go on to talk about. And the cycling occurred for a maximum of 28 days whilst they were on ITU or until ITU discharge, or if their mobility improved so much they were able to walk on the spot. The funding sources and equipment manufacturer had no role in this design of the RCT, just so we clear that up. So the primary outcome was looking at whether they did very well on their physical function intensive care unit test, which is the PFIT test, at 3 days post-ITU discharge. They chose to go for just the 3 days post-ITU discharge because obviously, as we know, a lot of our especially surgical patients here end up having very prolonged admissions, and actually the physiotherapy and their rehab can change and wane quite a lot when they go to our wards. So they felt it was more accurate to assess the ITU thing in a much shorter time frame. So the PFIT looks at 4 different things: the shoulder strength, leg strength, their sit to stand, and their ability to march on the spot. And it generates a score out of 10. And obviously, the higher the number, the better their function. There was lots of secondary outcomes to this study as well, your usual suspects, so things like duration of mechanical ventilation, duration of their ITU stay, mortality. But this study also looked at their frailty and their mental health further down the line. So focusing a little bit on the analysis, because that's mainly what my paper was looking at. It was a blinded interim analysis, and they did one at 180 patients, which was half of their study cohort, just to see if there were any kind of problems or whether the data was suggesting that they should be doing something else to avoid serious adverse effects. But everything was going to plan, which was very good. So they just carried on basically. They then were going to do linear regression, adjusting for age and site, because this was done over 3 sites, 3 countries: Australia, US, and Canada. And then they also looked at subgroups for age, their clinical score, and their sex. They then did some sensitivity analysis of the 5 areas to assess for the robustness of their findings. So unfortunately, now I've picked all of that up, when we got to the results, it actually was not as exciting as I thought it was going to be. So these results have kind of come out now more recently in 2024. And unfortunately, it has shown, or fortunately, has shown that there's no statistical significance between the cycling plus usual physiotherapy and the usual physiotherapy group. And you can see the 95% confidence interval there as well. And then these were the other categories that they broke it down to. And again, there's no statistical significance there as well. So this paper was first presented at the Critical Care Review in Belfast this year. And they had some interesting discussions on it, mainly surrounding kind of the timing for the PFIT. So as we sort of said, it's only 3 days post ITU discharge, and a lot of our patients still have a really long way to go on their rehab journey at that point. But as we discussed earlier, the main reason for doing that was to try and get rid of any other variables that will come into play further down the line. It also highlighted, obviously, there's a global workforce shortage. So some of the patients that were eligible to take part in this trial actually weren't recruited because there weren't physiotherapists available. And whilst it was acknowledged at the time that it was quite a good thing not to kind of be detrimental to the other patients that were already involved and not thin the physios out even further, it just highlighted that actually there was a lot more potential for rehab had there been more physiotherapists available. And obviously we know there's a global workforce shortage in healthcare anyway. They, as we said earlier, again, they excluded patients who were not independent prior to admission, and obviously normally that is not a barrier to physiotherapy. You still receive physiotherapy no matter what your baseline is prior to coming into hospital, obviously unless, you know, people are more abound. So that was something that this study probably could have improved on by widening that to people that are, you know, perhaps mobile with a frame or a stick. However, on the positive side, this was the largest trial of in-bed cycling for the critically ill. And as I said, they did do an interim analysis, which was very beneficial going forward. So that was it. So very short, very brief. But does anybody have any questions? Either at the Royal, no questions from the Royal, but from anyone, you guys over at other sites?
Thank you. And we don't have any questions. Thanks.
Lovely. Thanks, Molly.